They're going to court today at these states, and they're saying, listen, these two companies compete head to head, kind of quite aggressively on price. You know all this. They make this deal will has the likelihood of raising prices, particularly for poorer consumers. There's no precedent where these efficiencies have ever offset the anti-competitive harms. What say you?
The most important thing about this case, the most important job for the Federal Communications Commission is to get lots of spectrum out for companies to build 5G networks. This is a national imperative. This administration has not been able to get a success story here. The Department of Commerce has been anti-commerce in this particular topic. The FCC has not been able to get spectrum out of the regulatory swamp at the pace that I'm sure it would like to do. And this trial is very, very much about who will be able to get spectrum to build these 5G networks.
So it's your belief that if this deal is blocked by Judge Marrero in this case, it will retard the progression of 5G in our country?
That's my view, and the national security issue here is that China is going forward very, very quickly to build 5G networks, and even more importantly, Huawei, the big bugaboo of the entire world telecommunications industry, is able to use the deployment in China to perfect all of its advances in technology equipment. So the imperative here for the judge, I hope, and certainly for the FCC, is to get lots of spectrum out into the hands of people who will build 5G networks.
Yeah, but this is not as much about the FCC as it's about the DOJ, isn't it, Reed? I mean, there does seem to be this distrust in part and a sort of a more partisan approach, I guess. These are all Democratic AGs. Texas was there, and then they left. You know, you were serving a Democratic administration. What's your take here on, is this political as well as about protecting consumers?
So I'm one of the very few lawyers in the country who actually tried an antitrust case against state attorney generals all the way to a verdict. It's very rare for state attorney generals to ignore the Department of Justice, and it's even more rare for them to ignore both DOJ and the Federal Communications Commission. So yes, I think there is a political dimension to this. I think the fabric of trust between state attorney generals and this administration has been shredded and ripped along political lines. But that doesn't mean that the issue here is really in debate. Whether you're a state attorney general or whether you're in the federal government or whether you're in business, you know the most important question is getting that 5G spectrum out. And not much of that has actually happened in the last 3 years. It's an imperative.
So, Reed, I think that begs the question, what do you think is, given how rare it is, this moment in time we're in terms of this merger, what do you think the most likely scenario is? Is it some sort of deal with the AGs? Is it some sort of tighter, more robust, rules around what a fourth wireless carrier would look like?
Yes, the rules that are possible here are build-out requirements imposed by the Federal Communications Commission that would say, I'll give you the spectrum if you actually build the network. Now, what the FCC has said here is that they would impose those rules, and the Department of Justice thinks, along with the FCC, that the company that should have that obligation and should have the spectrum as an outcome of the merger is the company called Dish. So the question here that is going to be litigated, maybe the most important question, is whether Dish will live with those rules and whether it convinces the judge that it will do that build-out. And then the FCC has a lot of other spectrum that it needs to get out of the regulatory swamp and into commercial use.
Yeah, I want to dig into that piece of it a little bit more, Reed, as well. I just mentioned earlier that I was at the Reagan National Defense Forum over the weekend. One of the conversations I found myself having was actually around this idea of the spectrum itself where 5G is concerned. This idea that if the U.S. is really serious about this so-called 5G race with China, that the government, including, by the way, the military, which is sitting on quite a bit of spectrum, should arguably release more of it to the private sector. How do you see it?
No question about it. The Defense Department needs to take its cold hands off of a lot of spectrum. It needs to come up with a positive attitude toward the engineering solutions that allow satellite spectrum to be used terrestrially. Engineers know how to solve these problems now. They might not have been able to solve them a decade ago, but they know how to solve them now. And nobody should underestimate the business and engineering power behind the 5G rollout that's coming out of China. We have to hurry up in this country and solve our own political and regulatory problems to get that 5G spectrum deployed. This is the platform for the new next big thing, which is called edge computing or distributed computing. It's as important as the shift from the mainframe to the PC, and we have to lead in that too. That's really critical for our economy.
It's interesting to point out, of course, one of these companies is controlled by the Germans, the other is by a Japanese company.
Exactly. Well,
but Reed,
that's right, but they are operating here in the United States, and that's what I'm focused on.
I understand. Somebody else who operates, and you mentioned it, and Morgan did too, is Dish. I mean, Charlie Ergen, I made this point, conceivably will end up being a key witness in the case on both sides. Do you think that Dish can reliably become a true fourth competitor nationwide in 5G?
I would turn the question around. Is the government going to insist on those build-out requirements? Is the FCC and the Department of Justice going to require that the conditions be met? And is the FCC going to get a lot of other spectrum out of regulatory swamps and snafus? Is it going to solve its problems with the Department of Defense, which are solvable as an engineering matter? And are we really going to have a race to build 5G? That's what we want.
And finally, the Sprint and T-Mobile are going to also cite these MVNOs with our parent company Comcast, with Charter, essentially saying, hey, there's more than just wireless competitors. There are cable companies competing now. Do you see that as a true competitor?
I really do. There should be so much 5G spectrum out there that businesses and cable companies and companies we don't even know the name of yet should be deploying these networks, some at a small scale, some at a big national scale. And they are the platform for distributed computing, which, as I said, is the next new big thing and incredibly important to our economic and our social future as well, since so many good things can come from edge computing. So this trial is very, very important for the long-run future and well-being of the American economy.